My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 61 years old. The morning my son and his wife sat across from me at my own dining room table and told me I was becoming a burden, I poured myself a second cup of tea, nodded slowly, and said absolutely nothing. I let them talk. I let them use every soft, careful word they had rehearsed on the long drive over from Boston. Words like transition and support and quality of care, and the kind of community that really understands the needs of someone at this stage of life. I watched my son Nathan's hands move on the tablecloth as he spoke, those same hands I had held through every childhood fear and every hospital waiting room and every moment he had needed steadying. I sat there with my tea and my composure, and I let every word land exactly where they intended it to land. And while they talked, and while they slid the glossy brochure across my kitchen table, I thought one thing very clearly and very quietly. They have no idea what I have already done. What they did not know was that 3 weeks earlier, I had signed the final papers on a decision that was going to change everything they thought they understood about their future. What they did not know was that the estate they had been quietly counting on for the better part of 2 years, the house, the investment accounts, the retirement portfolio, every asset that had accumulated across 34 years of a careful marriage, the full $2,140,000 of it, was already gone. Not spent, not mismanaged, not lost to bad decisions, given away. Deliberately, thoughtfully, legally, and permanently directed to the people and causes that had actually earned it. What they also did not know, and this is the part I still think about in moments of particular satisfaction, is that there was a one-way ticket to Paris, sitting in a burgundy travel folder on my nightstand upstairs, with a departure date 11 days away. This is that story. Before I take you back to the beginning, I want to pause for just a moment and ask you something. Where in the world are you watching or listening to this right now? What city? What country? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below, because I find it extraordinary, truly extraordinary, that stories like this one travel so far and seem to find exactly the people who need them. If you connect with stories about women who stayed quiet, stayed composed, stayed completely in control, and then simply refused to let anyone else write the ending, please subscribe to Revenge Diary and give this video a like. Every woman's story deserves to be heard. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because this did not start at that dining room table. Betrayals never do. They start earlier, in the slow and careful way that a season changes, almost imperceptibly, until you realize one day that the temperature has dropped without anyone saying a word about it. My husband Douglas Whitmore built our life with his hands and his intellect, and 32 years of absolute discipline. He was a civil engineer by training and an entrepreneur by disposition, the kind of man who trusted a blueprint but trusted his instincts more. He started his own firm, Whitmore Engineering, at the age of 34, with 2 employees, 1 drafting table, and a reputation he had spent a decade building at a larger firm in Hartford. By the time he retired, Whitmore Engineering had completed major infrastructure projects across 6 states and employed 41 people. He was proud of that number, 41, because he said each one of those people had a family behind them, and that a business was only as real as the lives it made possible. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a principled one, and there is a difference that matters enormously. We lived in a 4-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Hill Drive in Burlington, Vermont. We had chosen that house together in the autumn of 1991, walking through it with a realtor who kept pointing out features we had already noticed and would have preferred to discover on our own. We bought it for $268,000, which was a stretch at the time, and we renovated it slowly and deliberately over the following 30 years. The kitchen came first, in 1998, when we finally had the money to do it properly, and Douglas insisted on the right countertops rather than the expedient ones. The back porch came in 2004. After a summer we spent eating dinner outside on lawn chairs and deciding we deserved a proper table and a roof. The 3rd bedroom became a library in 2011, floor-to-ceiling shelves that Douglas and a carpenter friend built over 3 weekends, and that held, by the time I left Burlington, over 1,200 books. That house was not an asset in the financial sense, although it became one. It was a life built in layers, each renovation a decision about what we wanted next, each room a record of who we had been at a particular moment. Douglas passed away in March of 2021 after a short illness, a diagnosis in November that moved quickly and gave us more clarity than time. He was 63 years old. The grief was the kind that does not announce itself loudly, that sits in the ordinary moments, the morning coffee made for one, the chair in the library with the good lamp angled for his eyes and not mine, the fishing gear in the garage that no one else knew how to sort. He was specific about his things, and I had learned his systems over 34 years, which meant that after he was gone, I knew exactly where everything was and exactly why it was there, and that made it both easier and harder in ways that fluctuated from day to day. Our son Nathan was 35 when his father died. He worked in commercial real estate in Boston, brokering deals on mid-size commercial properties across the greater Boston area, which sounded more stable than it was. He and his wife Kristen lived in a 3-bedroom townhouse in the South End, a neighborhood with good bones and serious price tags, and they had been redecorating it in stages for 4 years in ways that always seemed to cost more than anticipated and resolve less than intended. Kristen ran a side business selling a high-end skincare line through a network marketing structure, the kind that produces large team meetings and color-coded incentive charts and very little net income. She was 33, attractive in a curated way, fluent in the language of aspiration, and deeply convinced that the gap between where she was and where she intended to be was primarily a matter of timing and connection. She took a great many photographs of herself and posted them with captions about abundance and intention and showing up. She had been posting variations of the same photographs for 4 years. Nathan had never been cruel in any obvious way. He was not the kind of son who raised his voice or made cutting remarks or acted with any viciousness you could point to in a single moment. What he was, and what I had been watching for longer than I ever admitted to myself, was a calculator. He calculated affection in terms of investment. He calculated visits in terms of what they might produce. He calculated relationships the way his father calculated load-bearing structures, always asking where the weight was going to fall. It was not a trait Douglas had encouraged. It was something Nathan had developed on his own. Pasa from watching Douglas build something valuable and concluding that the building was the point, without understanding that Douglas had never once asked what the building was worth in dollars. He had only ever asked whether it was built right. At Douglas's funeral reception, before the last guests had finished their food, Nathan asked me about the will. I remember the exact moment. We were in the kitchen. I was wrapping leftovers in foil because I needed something to do with my hands, and Nathan came in and stood at the counter with his arms crossed and said, in a voice carefully calibrated to sound casual, "Mom, have you had a chance to think about the practical side of things? What Douglas left? What the plan is?" I looked at my son across the kitchen of the house I had lived in for 30 years and I said, very quietly, that today was not the day. He nodded and went back into the living room. I stood at the counter and I finished wrapping the food and I thought about nothing at all, because that was the only way to remain standing. The first clear signal came in the autumn following Douglas's death, approximately 6 months after the funeral. Nathan and Kristen came for a Sunday dinner, and at some point, while we were clearing the table, Nathan mentioned, with the particular lightness that people use when they have decided in advance, that what they are about to say is simply a practical matter worth considering. That there were some very well-designed communities being built outside Burlington now. He used the phrase active senior living, which I noted was not a phrase I had ever used to describe myself or my life. I was 60 years old. I had run a landscape design business for 22 years and had only recently scaled back my client load voluntarily. I changed the subject, and Nathan let it go, and nobody acknowledged what had just happened, which was that my son had looked at his recently widowed mother and seen the beginning of a transition. The second signal was harder to wave away. In January of 2022, Kristen called me on a Tuesday afternoon. This was unusual. Kristen almost never called without Nathan. She was warm on the phone in the way that people are warm when they have prepared a warmth, a specific manufactured intimacy with a purpose underneath. She asked how I was sleeping. She asked whether I was still driving much in the winter. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had been looking at the senior center calendar in Burlington, and there were some wonderful programs. She mentioned, twice within 4 minutes, the phrase "at your age." I counted both instances. I was 60 years old. I hiked, I drove everywhere without incident. I had rebuilt my landscape design practice into a 2-day-per-week consulting operation that I could have expanded if I had chosen to. I managed a financial portfolio that Douglas and I had spent 3 decades building, monitored it weekly, and understood it completely. At your age. I thanked Kristen for calling and told her I was perfectly well, and got off the phone and sat for a long time in Douglas's chair in the library, with all 1,200 books around me, and I understood something clearly for the first time. I had already been filed. In whatever ledger Nathan and Kristen kept internally, I had moved from one column to another, asset to liability, potential to problem, not yet, but soon. The campaign was already underway. I simply had not been informed that it had begun. The third signal was the one I was not supposed to hear. It was a Thursday evening in late October of 2022. Nathan and Kristen had come for dinner. I made roast chicken with the potatoes Douglas had always liked, and a salad from the garden, and we ate the way we always ate, with conversation that covered enough ground to seem genuine and stayed carefully above anything real. After dinner, Nathan's phone rang in the dining room and he answered it. I was in the kitchen running water over the dishes, which is one of those tasks that leaves your hands occupied but your attention entirely free. I could hear only Nathan's side of the conversation, and his side was sufficient. He said yes, she has no idea. He said the portfolio alone is probably somewhere around 900, maybe a bit less. He said the house I would put at 750, maybe 780, depending on how the market sits this spring. He said I'm thinking 6 months, a year at the outside. He said she's sharp but she's alone, and that changes things pretty fast. She's sharp but she's alone. I turned off the water. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I walked back into the dining room with the salad bowl in my hands, and I set it on the table and I said, "Who was that?" He said, "Just a friend from college, real estate stuff, boring." I said, "Of course." And I sat back down at the table, and I listened to Kristen talk about a new skincare product with results she described as genuinely miraculous, and I ate my dinner, and I decided. I want to pause here for a moment and speak directly to you. If you are watching this and something in this story is familiar, if you have sat at a table and understood that the people around it were measuring you rather than seeing you, if you have caught a word or a look that was not meant for you, and that changed the temperature of everything, I want you to know that you are not being dramatic. Your instincts are not an overreaction. What you felt was real, and what it told you was accurate. Drop a comment below and tell me if this is hitting somewhere close. Hit the subscribe button if you want to follow this story to the end, because the end is the part that took 11 months of the quietest, most deliberate work of my entire life, and it is worth it. After that Thursday, I changed nothing visible. I invited Nathan and Kristen for the holidays, as I always did. I sent birthday gifts on time. I answered calls. I mentioned the garden and the consulting work, and the Tuesday morning walks with my neighbor Francis, and the books I was reading. I was entirely present and entirely ordinary, and in the background, I was building something they were never going to see until it was finished. The first call I made was to Margaret Foley. Margaret had been Douglas's estate attorney for over a decade, and she had transitioned seamlessly to being mine. She was a small, precise woman in her mid-50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and who had the particular quality of a very good attorney, which is that she listened with her entire attention and said nothing until she had something worth saying. I asked her to meet me at her office in Burlington on a Wednesday morning in November of 2022. I told her I needed to make comprehensive changes to my estate plan, not minor adjustments to beneficiaries or percentages, a complete restructuring from the foundation. Margaret looked at me across her desk and said, "Tell me exactly what you want." So I did. I told her everything. I told her about October's phone call and January's phone call and the Sunday dinner with the active senior living language and the Thanksgiving after Douglas died when Nathan asked me what the plan was before the dessert had been served. I did not perform anger while I told it. I stated the facts in sequence and let them speak in their own voice. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "All right," and took out a legal pad and we began. Over the following 4 months, Margaret and I worked through every element of the estate with the precision of engineers reviewing a load plan. The house on Sycamore Hill, valued at that time at $780,000, would be listed for sale once the plan was finalized. The proceeds, combined with the investment portfolio, worth approximately $940,000, the savings accounts holding $160,000, and the remainder of the retirement accounts that had transferred to me after Douglas's passing, gave us a total estate value of $2,140,000. Every cent of it was to be redistributed away from the people who had been charting its course from a comfortable distance. I want to tell you where it went, because the destinations were not arbitrary. They were chosen and they were meaningful. $250,000 went to the Vermont Land Trust, which preserves working farmland, forests, and natural areas across the state. Douglas had cared deeply about the land of Vermont. He had fished its rivers and walked its ridgelines and said more than once that the thing about a place like this is that people assume it will always be there, and that assumption is exactly how it stops being there. It felt right that his money would protect what he had loved. $180,000 went to a nursing scholarship fund at the University of Vermont's medical school, established specifically in memory of Douglas Hartley Whitmore. One day, Nathan would drive past a building with his father's name on a program, or see it on a donor wall somewhere and understand, without anyone explaining it, exactly what had happened. $120,000 went to a domestic violence resource center in Burlington that I had supported quietly for years, a place that did urgent, unglamorous work with funding that was never secure enough. $100,000 to a reading and literacy foundation. $50,000 to the Burlington Public Library system, which had given me more than I could properly measure over a lifetime. The remainder, after legal fees and tax provisions, went into a donor-advised fund that would continue making distributions to selected causes at my direction for years to come. My own financial future was not left to chance. Douglas had been thorough in ways that I was still discovering. I had pension income through his firm's retirement structure, which transferred to me as the surviving spouse. I had my own Social Security income. I had a separate investment account that I had maintained in my name alone throughout our marriage, not because I had anticipated needing it for this purpose, but because Douglas and I had always believed that a person should have something that is entirely their own. It was modest compared to the full estate, but it was mine, and it was enough. I was not going to be wealthy the way I had been wealthy. I was going to be free, and I had decided that this was a different and better kind of wealth. The house went on the market in April of 2023. I did not tell Nathan. I hired Deborah Crane, a realtor who had sold 3 houses on Sycamore Hill in the previous 4 years and who understood the inventory and the buyer bio better than anyone. I told her I was simplifying my life after the loss of my husband. She did not ask questions beyond what was necessary, which I appreciated. The listing photographs were taken on a clear morning in late April when the maple in the front yard was beginning to leaf out and the porch light caught the stone steps the way it always had in spring, and the house looked exactly like itself, which was always its most persuasive quality. While the house was on the market, I began moving through it, room by room, in a way that was methodical rather than sentimental, although sentiment was present throughout. Douglas's books went to the public library in 23 boxes, which 3 library volunteers came to collect on a Saturday morning, and which produced a very genuine thank you note from the head librarian. His woodworking tools, which he had kept in perfect condition, and which he would have wanted to be used rather than stored, went to a vocational training program at the high school. His fishing gear went to a youth outdoor education nonprofit that ran programs for children who had never been given access to that kind of space. His winter coats and heavier clothing went to a men's shelter that needed them. I kept the things that were mine to keep: the books I had chosen myself, the landscape drawings and journals, the photographs that Douglas and I had chosen together for the walls, the small objects that had meaning private enough that I did not need to explain it to anyone. I packed them carefully, and I did not mourn the packing. I had done my mourning for Douglas in the 18 months since his death. What I was doing now was something different. I was clearing a space for the next version of myself to stand in. In May, I began researching Paris in the way I research everything, systematically, in detail, with more specificity than most people think is necessary, and exactly as much as I think it is. I had studied French for 2 years in college and let it lie dormant for almost 4 decades. I enrolled in a French conversation course at the Burlington Language Center, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, with an instructor named Claire who had grown up in Lyon and who had the particular patience of someone who genuinely believes that language is recoverable in any willing adult. After our 3rd session, she told me I had a good ear and that I formed my sentences carefully, which she said was more important in the long run than speed. It was the most uncomplicated compliment I had received in some time, and I held it carefully. I found the apartment before I booked the flight, because I needed to know the life existed before I could trust the ticket. A furnished 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a 19th century building on Rue de la Roquette in the 11th arrondissement of Paris. The photographs showed east-facing windows, a kitchen with a wooden table, walls the particular off-white of old European plaster that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. The rent was €1,400 per month, which was several $100s less than the monthly property taxes on the Burlington house. I paid the deposit by international transfer on a Thursday morning in May, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, and I felt something I recognized. It was the same feeling I had felt the afternoon Douglas and I signed the papers on the house on Sycamore Hill in 1991. Not excitement exactly, more like the sensation of a decision that has found its correct form. The flight was booked the following week, Air France departing Boston's Logan on May 28th, arriving Charles de Gaulle on the morning of May 29th. One way. I printed the confirmation and put it in the burgundy travel folder, alongside the apartment lease and the contact information for my new French bank account, and I placed the folder on my nightstand where I could see it when I woke up in the mornings. Nathan called in mid-May to arrange a visit, which I had been expecting. He had increased the frequency of his calls in recent weeks, which I understood as positioning. More presence equals more claim. I agreed to a Saturday morning. I said, "Come for coffee." He said, "Great, we'll bring pastries." Kristen added, from the background of Nathan's phone, that there were things they wanted to talk through together, as a family. I said I looked forward to it, and I meant that in the most complete sense possible. The offer on the house arrived during the first week of May from a couple relocating from New York City who needed the space and the quiet, and who had looked at 4 other properties before walking through mine and making an offer within 48 hours, $765,000, $15,000 below asking. I accepted the same afternoon. Closing was set for June 10th. I would be in Paris by then. The Saturday came. Nathan and Christison pulled into the driveway at 10:17 in the morning. I watched them from the kitchen window while the tea finished steeping. I noticed the way Kristen straightened her jacket before she got out of the car and the way Nathan stood for a moment looking at the house with that particular quality of attention that was not admiration. I had set the kitchen table the way I always set it for guests. The good cups, the small jug of cream, the plate of almond cookies I baked from the recipe I had been using for 20 years. I wanted the morning to be pleasant. I wanted to be in my own kitchen, in my own house, at my own table, on my own terms, one final time. They came in. We settled at the table. Nathan opened with the gentleness of a man who has rehearsed his opening. He said that he and Kristen had been concerned for a while, that the house was more than one person could reasonably manage, that the winters in Burlington were difficult, that they had done some research. Kristen said they wanted to make sure I had real support, the kind that was consistent and professional, and that would give everyone peace of mind. Nathan slid the brochure across the table. Hearthstone Village, a continuing care retirement community in Montpelier, Vermont. Private suites beginning at $4,200 per month, with memory care available on the same campus. I picked up the brochure. I turned it over. I set it back on the table. I looked at the almond cookies, and then I looked at my son. Kristen said, "We just want you to be safe, Eleanor." She said my first name with a deliberateness that I recognized. She said, "Maintaining a house this size alone, and the winters, we worry about you driving. We think this could be the right next step." I did not speak immediately. I let the silence sit for a full count of 5. Then I said, "I appreciate you both coming. I know this took some planning." Nathan said, "Mom, it's not a conversation we wanted to have." "No," I said. "I imagine not." I reached behind me to the kitchen counter where I had put the burgundy travel folder that morning. I set it on the table between the Hearthstone brochure and the cookie plate. I said, "I have something to share as well." I opened the folder. I placed 3 documents on the table in order. The first was the signed offer on the house with the purchase price and the closing date visible. The second was a 1-page summary Margaret had prepared outlining the charitable structure of the estate distribution in sufficient detail that the shape of it was clear, even if the specific organizations were not listed. The third was the Air France booking confirmation. Paris, May 28th. 1 passenger, 1 way. The silence lasted long enough that I could hear the refrigerator running from the other side of the kitchen. Nathan's eyes moved across each document separately. I watched the information arrive in his face in stages, first confusion, then comprehension, then a cold, specific understanding of what he was looking at. Kristen picked up the flight confirmation and read it in full. She set it back on the table with a careful, controlled motion. Nathan said, "You sold the house. I have a buyer. Closing is June 10th, without telling us." "It's my house, Nathan." He looked at the second document. His jaw squirmed slightly before he spoke. "What does this mean? Charitable distribution? The entire estate?" "The estate has been redirected to a group of organizations that reflect Douglas's values and mine." Margaret Foley handled the legal structure. "Everything is properly documented and finalized." Kristen's voice had changed quality. "Eleanor, you can't just. There are tax implications. There are family considerations. There are things that need to be discussed before a decision like this." "Kristen," I said very quietly and very evenly, "I have an estate attorney and a financial advisor who both agree that everything is properly structured. The tax implications have been addressed." Nathan said, "Is this because of us? Is this about today?" "No," I said. "This started well before today. I believe it started around October of last year. A Thursday evening, you were in the dining room, on the phone. I was in the kitchen." I paused. "I have a good ear." The silence that came after that was different from the silences before it. It was not confusion. It was recognition. Nathan went absolutely still. Kristen looked at the window, at the maple in the front yard, at anything that was not my face or the documents on the table. "I'm not angry with either of you," I said, and I meant it completely. "I understand the logic of what you were planning. You saw a situation that looked manageable from a distance, and you made reasonable assumptions about how it would unfold. I simply made different assumptions earlier and acted on mine first," Nathan said, in a voice that had dropped below strategy into something rawer. "We weren't trying to take anything." I looked at my son. "The Hearthstone brochure includes memory care on the same campus," I said. "I am 61 years old. I drive without incident. I manage my own finances without error. I have been studying French for 7 weeks and my instructor says I have a good ear." I paused. "Memory care should not have been in the same brochure you brought to this table." Nobody spoke. Kristen reached forward after a moment and took an almond cookie. I noticed that. People reach for something solid when the argument has run out. She ate it in 2 small bites. Nathan stood and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to us for a moment, and when he spoke his voice had changed again, past the real estate register, past the strategic gentleness, into something that was simply his own voice. The voice of my son standing at a window while his understanding of a future rearranged itself around him. He said, "What are we supposed to do now?" I said, "The same thing you would have done had I been at Hearthstone Village. Figure out your own way forward." I closed the travel folder. The 3 documents went back inside aside. I picked up my tea. They stayed another 20 minutes. Nathan asked twice more about the estate, and I referred him both times to Margaret. Kristen said almost nothing after the cookie. At 11:54, they stood and put on their coats, and I walked them to the door and said goodbye with the same composure I had maintained throughout the morning, because composure had been the only weapon I needed, and I had not let it go once. I watched Nathan's car reach the end of Sycamore Hill Drive and turn out of sight. Then I went inside and washed the coffee cups and wrapped the remaining cookies in foil and called Margaret and told her the morning had proceeded exactly as anticipated. The days between that Saturday and my departure were among the most peaceful of my adult life. There is a particular quiet that settles over a house when you have made a complete decision and there is nothing left to decide, only to do. I finished packing with great care, moving through the rooms one final time, touching the things I was leaving and the things I was taking with a clarity that surprised me. I said goodbye to the library last. I stood in the middle of it for a long time, and I thought about Douglas building those shelves, and about every book I had read in that room, and about the 11 years the room had been what it was. Then I turned off the light and closed the door. My neighbor Frances Alcott came to say goodbye on the Sunday before my departure. Frances and I had walked together on Tuesday mornings for 11 years, through every kind of Vermont weather, and she knew more about my life than almost anyone. She brought a bottle of Burgundy, and we finished most of it on the back porch in the evening, talking about Douglas and about the strangeness of choosing a life that no one else would have predicted, and about what it means to be 61 and standing at the beginning of something rather than the end of something. She asked if I was afraid. I thought about it genuinely before I answered. I said I was aware. She said that was better than either afraid or confident. I thought she was right. Nathan called on the Tuesday before I left. The tone was different from any conversation we had managed in the past 2 years. The calculation was gone from his voice, and what was underneath it was something more honest and less comfortable. He said he was trying to understand. I said there was not much to understand, only to accept. He said he had not meant for things to become what they became. I said I believed him, and that intent and outcome were different things, and both mattered, and only one of them could still be changed, which was the intent he carried forward. He was quiet after that, and then he said, simply, "Are you going to be okay?" Just that. Not "Are you thinking clearly?" or "Have you considered the implications?" Just the plain, unarmored question of a son who was frightened for his mother in the way that fear arrives when you strip everything else away. I said, "I'm going to be more than okay, Nathan. I'm going to be free." He did not have an answer for that. I let him hold the silence until he was ready to let it go. On the morning of May 28th, I locked the front door of the house on Sycamore Hill Drive at 5:15 in the morning. The sky was the dark blue of very early morning, before the light has committed to arriving. I put the keys in the mailbox for Deborah Crane. My cab came at 5:22. I had 2 suitcases, a carry-on, the burgundy travel folder, and a small cedar tackle box that had belonged to Douglas, the one thing of his I was taking with me, because Douglas had loved rivers, and I thought he deserved to see something new. At the airport, I sat at the gate and went through the phrases in the notebook Claire had given me, reading each one aloud quietly enough that only I could hear. The plane boarded at 7:40. I chose the window seat because I wanted to see the Atlantic. I put on my headphones and settled in, and as the plane lifted from Boston and banked east over the water, I let myself think about Douglas. Once, just once, the way I do when something matters. I thought that he would have understood this completely. He was the most practical man I ever knew, and he would have seen the logic of it before I finished explaining the first sentence. And I thought he would have laughed, not from cruelty but from recognition, because he had known for 34 years exactly, boss, what I was capable of when I decided something, and he had found it. Always the thing I loved most about him, entirely believable. I landed at Charles de Gaulle on the morning of May 29th. The apartment on Rue de la Roquette was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of old stone and something warm and unidentifiable that I came to associate over the following weeks with the whole of the 11th arrondissement in the warmer months. It is a neighborhood that is not fashionable in the Marais sense, not gilded or curated, but lived in at an honest pace by people who know their neighbors and use their streets as extensions of their homes. The kind of neighborhood that Douglas would have liked immediately, and without needing to be told why. The windows of the apartment faced east, and the light came in at a particular angle in the mornings that is different from any light I had known in Vermont. European morning light is older somehow, light that has been landing on old stone for a very long time and has learned to do it without fanfare. It fell across the wooden kitchen table like an arrangement rather than an accident. I found the boulangerie on the first morning, where a man behind the counter said bonjour, and I said bonjour back, and we had a brief transaction about croissant that I navigated almost entirely in French, with only one significant grammatical error that he was too polite to correct. I bought 2 croissants and a café au lait and sat at a small table on the pavement outside, and I watched Paris conduct its morning business, and I thought, with a completeness and a simplicity that surprised me, yes, this is exactly correct. Life in Paris organized itself around new rhythms, which is one of the great gifts of starting somewhere unfamiliar. You cannot import your old schedule into a new city, and so you must build one from the materials the city offers. And the materials Paris offers are extraordinary in their variety and their patience. I enrolled in a formal French language program at an institute in the 4th arrondissement. Classes 3 mornings per week, and I discovered that my ear was better than I had understood, possibly because I had spent a lifetime learning to listen very carefully to what people were actually saying as opposed to what they meant to say, and these are different skills that turn out to require the same underlying attention. I joined a Saturday walking group that covered a different quartier of Paris each week, led by a retired archivist named Bernard, who wore a flat cap in every weather and who stopped every 40 meters to describe the history of whatever wall or doorway was nearest to him in the fond, exacting manner of a man who has made his peace with the fact that not everyone walks as slowly as he does. I became, over several Saturdays, someone who did not need to hurry. I found the Sunday market near the Canal Saint-Martin, where the cheese woman eventually began saving me the Comté she knew I preferred, which is a kind of friendship that requires patience and consistency, and which I found, when it arrived, more satisfying than I had anticipated. I began a landscape journal, sketching the parks and planted spaces of the city with the same observational discipline I had practiced for 2 decades of professional work. I discovered that my eye for plants was entirely portable, that a well-placed hornbeam or a disciplined pleached lime spoke exactly the same design language in Paris that it spoke in Burlington, Vermont, and that knowledge that I had seemed rooted to one place was actually rooted to me. Nathan emailed in July. The tone was quieter and more genuine than anything we had exchanged in 2 years. He asked how I was. I wrote back with real detail: the language classes, the Sastumars, the landscape, journal, the particular quality of the Tuesday afternoon light on the Canal Saint-Martin. He wrote back and said it sounded like I had built something good. I said I was in the process of building it, and that the building was the thing, not the finished product, a lesson that I believed his father had tried to teach by example, and that perhaps required some time to arrive. He wrote back and said he had been thinking about Dad a lot lately. I said that was good. That was the right thing to be doing. He asked if he could come visit sometime, and I said, of course, that there was a great deal worth seeing, and that he would need to find his own accommodation since the apartment had 1 bedroom, and that this was probably appropriate given that we were both going to need some neutral ground to stand on for a while. He said he understood. I believed him. Kristen sent a separate email 3 weeks after Nathan's, which I found more interesting than his. She referenced the Tuesday call from January, specifically, including the phrase "at your age," which she named directly without my prompting. She said she was sorry for it. She said some things that I could see had been difficult to write because they required her to revise a story she had been telling herself, and that is always harder than writing something new. I wrote back. I accepted the apology. I said I hoped she would carry forward the distinction between caring for someone and managing them, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between a relationship and an administration. She wrote back 1 word: understood. I thought that was a reasonable place to start. The house on Sycamore Hill Drive closed on schedule on June 10th. The funds distributed exactly as Margaret had arranged. In August, I received notification that the first grant from the donor-advised fund had been sent to the Domestic Violence Center in Burlington. In September, a letter arrived from the University of Vermont with a photograph and a short biography. The first Douglas Whitmore Memorial Nursing Scholarship had been awarded to a young woman named Amara, who was in her 2nd year of her nursing degree, and who wrote in the letter about what medicine meant to her, in terms that were direct and specific and not at all performed. I read the letter 4 times. I set it on the kitchen table in the Paris light, and I thought about Douglas, and I thought about the 41 people he had employed, and the structures they had built, and the families behind them. And I thought that money, when it goes to the right hands, becomes something entirely different than when it sits waiting to be inherited. I have thought a great deal in these months about what I would say to a woman who recognizes something of her own life in this story, not the specific details which belong to me, but the shape of it. The moment when the people around the table begin to measure you instead of seeing you. The particular loneliness of understanding that the categorization has already happened, that someone decided what chapter you were in before you had finished writing the previous one. The strange quiet of sitting across from people who love you, or believe they love you, while they discuss the management of a future that is not theirs to manage. I know that quiet. It settles in your chest like cold water, and it tells you something important, not that you are helpless, but that the time for waiting is finished. I will not tell you to be angry. Anger is real, and sometimes anger is the first honest thing that moves through you after a long period of numbness, and that is fine. But anger is a starting point, not a destination. What I will tell you is something simpler than that. You do not have to ask permission to live your life in the form you choose. You do not need to justify your competence or your clarity or your capacity to people who have already decided, for their own reasons, that your time is running out. Your time is not running out. It is running forward, the same as it always was. And the only question that matters is whether you are pointing in a direction you chose or in a direction someone else chose for you when they thought you were not paying attention. The most powerful thing I did in this entire story was not the donation. It was not the sale of the house, or the flight, or the apartment in Paris. It was that Thursday evening in October, standing at the kitchen sink with the water running, listening to my son price out my life over the phone, and deciding in that moment not to perform any of what I felt, not to ask him about it, not to argue, not to defend myself in advance, or explain myself in advance, or do any of the things that women are so thoroughly trained to do when they feel their autonomy beginning to shrink. I simply decided that I would act, quietly and completely, and on my own timeline, and let the truth arrive in the form I had prepared for it, at the table I had set on the morning I had chosen. That is not revenge. It is something older than that and quieter than that, and far more complete. It is simply the decision of a woman who understood that she did not owe anyone a warning. If something in this story has landed close to home for you, I genuinely want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you are, what you felt, what the story opened up, or just the one word that describes what you carried out of it. And if you have not yet subscribed to Revenge Diary, I am asking you directly. Every story we tell is about a woman who was underestimated and who chose not to explain herself, only to act. Come be part of that. I am writing this from the kitchen table on Rue de la Roquette on a Saturday afternoon in October. The light in the 11th arrondissement in autumn has a warmth that I do not have an adequate word for yet in French or in English, though I am working on it. My lease has been extended twice. The boulangerie man knows my order without my asking. The cheese woman at the Sunday market saves the Conte. My French is now good enough that I have been reading novels in it, slowly with a dictionary at my elbow and finding that the slowness is not a limitation but a deepening. I am 62 years old. I am the quietest I have ever been and the most deliberately alive. That is what deciding looks like from the inside. I hope you get to feel it. Thank you for being here. Truly, it means more than you might expect to know that this story found you, wherever in the world you are, whatever time it is, whatever brought you to press play today. If these stories reach you, if they sit somewhere real, please subscribe to Revenge Diary and turn on notifications so you never miss one. We release a new story every single day, because every day there is a woman somewhere who stayed composed when she had every reason not to, who planned in silence and acted with precision, and whose story deserves to be heard. Share this video with someone who needs it. Leave a comment so we know you were here. We see every one of them, and we are grateful for every single one of you. I will see you in the next story.